Denny Hamlin did not quietly accept what happened. He did not give the diplomatic answer that team veterans usually give when a controversial call goes against them. He looked directly at the situation, at the people responsible, and said exactly what he thought. And Joe Gibbs Racing has not been the same since. Denny Hamlin did not give the diplomatic answer. He did not shake his head, say it was a tough call, and move on the way veterans sometimes do when they know the cameras are still rolling and the sponsors are still watching. He looked directly at what happened, said exactly what he thought about it, and when the people around him suggested he soften the message, he refused. That refusal is what this story is actually about. The controversial call came at a moment in the race where Joe Gibbs Racing could not afford to get it wrong. Hamlin was running in a position that mattered, not just for that Sunday, not just for the points that week, but for the momentum that a team in JGR's current situation desperately needs to protect. The call went against them. The consequences were immediate and visible. And by the time Hamlin came back to pit road, the damage to his race was already done in a way that clean laps and good restarts were not going to fix. You could feel his temperature rising before he even got out of the car. This was not the body language of a driver frustrated with bad luck or a mechanical failure. This was something more controlled than that, and somehow more dangerous because of it. Hamlin has been in this sport long enough to separate racing incidents from decision failures. He had already made that separation before the checkered flag dropped. And when a driver of his experience and his stature makes that separation that quickly, what comes next is never going to be diplomatic. He came to the media and he did not hold back. The call was wrong. The timing was wrong. The consequences were predictable and preventable. He said it clearly, he said it specifically, and when the follow-up questions came looking for him to walk it back even slightly, he refused, every single time. The message stayed exactly where he put it the first time. This cost Joe Gibbs Racing a result they needed, and somebody inside that organization has to own that. That is not a normal post-race response from a driver at Hamlin's level. Drivers who have been in this sport as long as he has developed a very precise understanding of what they can say publicly without creating problems that follow them back into the hauler on Monday morning. Hamlin knows exactly where that line is. He has spent years operating close to it. What he said after this race was not close to the line, it was over it, and he knew it was over it when he said it, which means he decided the line did not matter this time. Think about what that decision actually costs a driver in his position. Hamlin is not a young driver who can afford to burn organizational goodwill and rebuild it over 5 more seasons. He is a veteran whose championship window is defined by how well Joe Gibbs Racing can execute around him right now. This season, these races, these opportunities. Every time he goes public with criticism that lands internally as a challenge to the organization's decision-making, he is spending relationship capital that he cannot easily replace. He knew that going into that media session, he spent it anyway. That tells you everything about how significant this call felt to him from the inside. Now there is a layer to this story that the surface coverage completely missed, because what Hamlin said publicly after the race was the version he decided was safe enough to say on camera. What he said inside the JGR hauler after the cameras left, according to people who were present for those conversations, was considerably more direct, not angrier necessarily, more specific. The kind of specific that names processes, identifies the exact point where the decision chain broke down, and makes clear that the person delivering the message has been paying attention to this pattern for longer than one race weekend. And that word, pattern, is the one that should make Joe Gibbs racing genuinely uncomfortable right now. If this kind of inside the garage NASCAR coverage is what you have been looking for, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me whether you think Hamlin was right to go public the way he did, or whether he should have kept this inside the hauler. And subscribe if you are not already here, because what has been building inside JGR this season is bigger than one controversial call, and the next part of this story is where that becomes impossible to ignore. Because Hamlin refusing to back down after this call was not the start of a problem at Joe Gibbs Racing. It was the moment a problem that already existed finally broke the surface. The call itself needs to be understood properly before anything else makes sense. Joe Gibbs Racing made a decision during that race that put Hamlin in a position he could not recover from competitively. The specifics of that call, the timing, the reasoning, the alternatives that were available and not taken, are exactly the kind of thing that gets debated in post-race debriefs for hours. Inside the team, those conversations happen with data and telemetry and full context. Outside the team, all anyone can see is the result, and the result was a race that JGR lost in a way that felt avoidable to anyone watching closely. Hamlin's frustration was not about the outcome alone. Outcomes in NASCAR are always partially about luck, partially about execution, partially about factors nobody controls. What Hamlin was pointing at was the execution piece, the part of the equation that a team at JGR's level and with JGR's resources is supposed to get right. And in his view, they did not get it right, not because of bad luck, because of a bad decision made by people whose job is to not make bad decisions in exactly that moment. That distinction matters enormously to a driver of his experience. Racing luck is absorbed and moved past. Decision failures are examined and argued about and remembered. Hamlin was not ready to absorb this one and move past it. He was ready to examine it and argue about it, and he was not willing to do that quietly. Now look at what Joe Gibbs Racing was dealing with internally in the hours after this race. They had a veteran driver who had just gone on camera and publicly challenged the organization's decision, making in a way that every other driver on the roster heard, every sponsor representative noticed, and every competitor in that garage filed away for future reference. The organizational response to that moment, how JGR handled Hamlin's public comments internally, whether they pushed back or absorbed it. Whether the people responsible for the call were held accountable or defended, that response was going to define the dynamic between Hamlin and the team for the rest of this season. And the response was careful in a way that felt more like damage control than genuine accountability. But here is what nobody is talking about yet. This was not the first time this season that a Joe Gibbs Racing strategic decision left Hamlin in a position he should not have been in. It was the first time he said it publicly. The difference between those two things is important because it tells you something about how much had been accumulating inside that hauler before this race became the breaking point. Drivers at Hamlin's level do not go public with organizational criticism after one bad call. They go public after a series of bad calls that they have already raised privately and felt were not being addressed properly. Which means somewhere in the JGR internal record for this season, there are conversations where Hamlin flagged concerns that did not result in the changes he was asking for. And this race, this specific call at this specific moment, was the one where his patience with the private process ran out. That reframes his refusal to back down completely. This was not a driver reacting emotionally to a bad Sunday. This was a driver who had been watching a pattern develop, raising it through the proper channels, and finally deciding that the proper channels were not producing results. Going public was not an emotional reaction. It was a calculated escalation from a driver who understood exactly what he was doing and decided the cost was worth it. Joe Gibbs Racing now has to respond to that escalation in a way that either addresses the underlying pattern Hamlin is pointing at or risks watching him escalate further. And a driver who has already demonstrated that he is willing to go public with organizational criticism is a driver who has also demonstrated that the next escalation is possible if the response is not sufficient. Christopher Bell and Ty Gibbs are watching this dynamic play out from inside the same organization. Every driver on that roster is now recalibrating their understanding of what is acceptable to say publicly about JGR's decision-making, because Hamlin just moved the line and nobody has officially moved it back. That is the part of this story that goes way beyond one controversial call at one race. Here is the bigger picture that makes Denny Hamlin's refusal to back down feel less like a post-race complaint and more like a defining moment for Joe Gibbs Racing's entire 2026 season. JGR is not in the same position it was 3 years ago. The organization that dominated NASCAR for a generation, that put multiple drivers in championship contention seemingly every season as a matter of organizational routine, is in a period where the results do not match the resources the way they used to. The cars are capable. The drivers are capable, but the execution gaps that Hamlin is pointing at publicly are showing up in the standings in ways that are harder and harder to explain away as bad luck. Hamlin knows this better than anyone. He has been inside this organization through its dominant years and through the years where the dominance slipped. He knows what JGR looks like when everything is working, and he knows what it looks like when something is systematically wrong. And right now, he is publicly telling anyone who will listen that something is systematically wrong. Not with the cars, not with the drivers, but with the decisions being made around those cars and drivers at critical moments. That is a specific and serious accusation from a driver who has earned the credibility to make it. The championship implications are real and they are compounding. Every race where a decision failure costs Hamlin points is a race that his competitors banked without earning an advantage on the track. The gap between where Hamlin should be in the standings based on his car's capability and where he actually is based on his results is the number that is driving this frustration more than any single call. He is not behind because the car is slow. He is behind because the execution around that car has not matched what the car deserves, and he is done pretending that is not the case. Look at where this leaves Joe Gibbs Racing as an organization for the second half of this season. They have their most experienced driver in a public posture of challenge toward the organization's decision-making. They have a roster of other drivers who are watching how this situation gets handled as a signal for how their own concerns would be treated if they raised them. And they have a championship window with Hamlin that does not stay open indefinitely. Every season that passes without resolving the execution gaps he is pointing at is a season that cannot be recovered. The response from JGR ownership and leadership to what Hamlin said publicly will matter more than any single strategic call for the rest of this year. Because drivers in Hamlin's position who go public with organizational criticism and do not see meaningful change in response do not quietly return to the private channel. They keep escalating. And the next escalation from a driver of Hamlin's profile and his history with this sport would create a story that makes this one look small. Denny Hamlin has been at Joe Gibbs Racing for his entire Cup Series career. That relationship is built on more history and more shared success than almost any driver-team combination in the modern era of NASCAR. The fact that he is publicly refusing to back down from a challenge to that organization's decision-making tells you something uncomfortable about where that relationship is right now. The question that nobody at Joe Gibbs Racing wants to answer publicly is this: if the execution gaps Hamlin is pointing at do not get fixed before the playoff picture becomes clear, does a driver who has spent his entire career at one organization start thinking about what the last chapter of that career looks like somewhere else? That question does not have an answer yet. But Hamlin's refusal to back down after this race means it is now a question that exists. And questions like that, once they exist inside a garage, have a way of demanding answers whether the organization is ready to give them or not. Was Hamlin right to go public the way he did, or should he have kept this fight inside the JGR hauler, where it could have been resolved without the whole sport watching? Drop your answer in the comments, because this one is genuinely dividing NASCAR fans, and I want to know exactly where you stand on it. If this is the kind of coverage that gets into what actually matters inside these organizations, leave a comment. And subscribe, because the Hamlin and JGR story is one of the most important ones in NASCAR right now, and every development in it is going to be covered right here.